Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another random review. Today's random review is the David Greene film I Start Counting from 1969. This is on BFI Flipside, and it's Flipside number 42. Frank Zappa would be a fan of this film because it's about Catholic girls. David Greene is an interesting director, originally born in Manchester, spent a lot of time in Canada. His filmography is all over the place. He did the remake of Night of the Hunter with Richard Chamberlain. But recently, a couple of his films have appeared on Indicator, and that's The People Next Door, which is by number 210. With Eli Wallach and Julie Harris and Hal Holbrook, which from 1970, which is about drugs and drug use in teenagers in the suburbs. It's not a great film, but it is an interesting film. And then he did Grey Lady Down, so you can even tell just by these two films that he was a bit all across the board. This is a fine little submarine disaster film from 1978. But this does give me an excuse to point out one of the greatest special features in Indicator history, nay, physical media history. It's a 41-minute interview with film historian Alan K. Rode. Now, if you've seen a lot of film noir physical media releases, you'll probably recognise his face as a film critic who talks about film noir. But he actually was a Navy officer who was involved in the submarine rescue program, and he basically gives a history lesson of the submarine rescue program for 40 minutes, which is absolutely fascinating, about the accidents, like the famous submarine, the USS Thresher accident, and various other accidents that led to let's have a submarine rescue program, and the kind of machines that go down to get the crew. Alan K. Rode was actually in charge of the maintenance on one of them. One of his colleagues is briefly in the film, shaking hands with Charlton Heston. It's an absolutely fascinating piece. You could be cynical and say it's actually better than the film, but the film's solid. It's Sunday afternoon entertainment. But that extra with Alan K. Rode is Indicator at its absolute finest. But let's talk about I Start Counting. This is from 1969. So this is probably before he went to Hollywood to make a kind of various bunch of films. It stars Jenny Agutter, who was 16, 17 at the time. She plays a 15-year-old schoolgirl, Catholic schoolgirl called Wynne Kinch. Great name. It's based on a novel. It also stars Brian Marshall, who you'll probably recognise his face from Long Good Friday and various other things. And she is an adopted child into this family where Brian Marshall is her much older brother. She has another older brother who works in a record store, and the town is in the grip of somebody killing young girls. So it's part serial killer film, even though not really in the conventional sense, and part coming of age. It's about her burgeoning sexuality and attraction towards George, her much older stepbrother. her relationship with her friend, her school friend Corinne, who's the much more kind of outgoing and lascivious, and talks about all the men she's had sex with, even though she hasn't. She's kind of almost a comic relief character, to give you a rest between all the intense stuff in the film. It was an interesting 3-year run for Agutter, who is a national treasure, really. She did this in 1969, and then in 1970 she did The Railway Children. In 1971 she did Walkabout with Nick Rogue. The production designer, Brian Eatwell, actually did the production design on Walkabout as well. The film starts with a look at her bedroom and kind of master shot, and then the camera slowly goes round her bedroom. There is a white rabbit from Alice in Wonderland. There's a loose kind of Alice in Wonderland vibe to the film, but it just uses the white rabbit motif. It's obviously burgeoning from childhood into adolescence and adulthood, with a focus on the sexual side. There's a wonderful scene where the local priest comes to the school and answers questions about sex, and of course Corinne, her friend, wants to know about incest as a kind of dig in the ribs to win. It's a really interesting film on various levels. It's quite an effective little thriller about a serial killer. We're led to about 3 suspects, one of which is George, the older brother, because Wynne gave him this sweater, and she keeps asking about the sweater because she finds the sweater which he's tried to get rid of and there's blood on it. So it kind of works as a serial killer thriller, and when it does do those bits, it's rather tense and really effective and really effectively shot. It's kind of an amateur sleuth film, as Wynne tries to find out what's George doing and what he's doing at night and who he's meeting at night. But it's also a really effective coming of age film, which I'm not really a fan of particularly, but just because it's mixed in with other things, it really works here and it's really effective. It's helped by Jenny Agutter with perhaps one of her best performances, even though she's only like 16 or 17. But it's also a fascinating period in Britain, 1969. It's kind of the end of the quote-unquote swing 60s, which only really lasted for a couple of years, really. It's the birth of the new town, so you get this kind of view of this kind of antiseptic new town. There's an area of the town that's getting bulldozed, which again is symbolic. They used to live in an old house where a bad thing may have happened, and it's due for demolition. They now live in a shiny aseptic flat in the new town. Wynne keeps going back to the old house. George doesn't want her to go back. And again, it's about childhood and putting your childhood away and literally demolishing it. So you have that. And again, the production design by Brian Eatwell is really interesting, because again, it's of its time, but it's actually quite interesting in that juxtaposition of old world and new world. So the younger brother, who's still probably 17 or 18, he works in a record store, and again you have the white plastic bubbles of listening booths, and on the back wall it's just like multiple copies of the same image of Jimi Hendrix. there's the new Catholic Church, which again is just, it's kind of all white and all kind of plastic and really interesting design. The film was actually shot in Bray Studios, which is famous for where the Hammer films were filmed. But the church is really interesting design. It's one of the best confessionals as far as design that I've ever seen in a film. It's really interesting. So you have all this going on, so you can kind of tell why when it came out it pretty much just disappeared. And again, I'd never heard of it until the BFI release, and it is a spectacular release. I mean, again, the film doesn't look absolutely amazing, but it looks a whole lot better than I imagine what it looked like when it came out. It did kind of sink without a trace, but you can kind of see why, because there's so many elements going on at the one time, but they're all quite fascinating. So the actual release itself, you do get a booklet which is full of stuff. It is a 2K restoration from the 35mm interpositive. There's a wonderful interview with Jenny Agutter for 20 minutes from 2020. I mean, again, she is a national treasure. There's a 40-minute interview from 2021 from screenwriter Richard Harris, who wrote The Avengers and A Touch of Frost and plenty of other things in his career. There is a 33-minute interview with Johnny Trunk, founder of cult label Trunk Records, as he revisits the life and art of ambient music pioneer Basil Kirchen, who does the score, and it is a very interesting score. I Start Building, which is a selection of New Town films from 1942 to 1959, 25 minutes, which again is pretty fascinating. And then we have Danger on Dartmoor from 1980, which is a 57-minute children's film foundation, which was written by Audrey Erskine Lindop, who wrote the novel I Start Counting. And then we have Don't Be Like Brenda from 1973, an 8-minute film about teenage pregnancy and teenage promiscuity. Don't Be Like Brenda. Poor Brenda does get dumped on in this film quite badly, because she should have waited until she was married, because that's when you should only have kids, when you're married and when they're wanted, not some transient love affair. So don't be like Brenda. Poor Brenda. And then there's A Loss of Innocence, which is a video essay by filmmaker Chris O'Neill on I Start Counting. And there's an audio commentary by Sam Dagan. So it's absolutely stacked with good stuff. I would highly recommend picking it up. Again, if you're expecting your conventional serial killer film, it's not that. Even though when it does do that kind of stuff, it's actually very effective. We're kind of boiled down to 3 suspects. You know, the film opens wonderfully looking across a body of water at kids kind of throwing stones at something in the water, a can or something like that. And then the camera slowly pans further back and we go through the reeds, and then we see a woman's face under the water who's obviously dead. So it's really effective. The stuff at the end of the film when we get into finding out who's actually the killer, which is really effective and again really off-putting. You know, there's some creepy elements to the film as Wynne kind of has daydreams and fantasies, not only about George but about her childhood and her past life. And again, if you're expecting a kind of coming of age, a kind of comedy about, you know, young girls finding their way as far as their attitudes to sex, it's not quite that either. So it kind of falls between about 3 different stools, but I think it still works, and it's actually better for it for being a kind of strange brew of all this stuff going on. It's just a wonderful film, and again, another wonderful release from BFI of a film that would have just come and went and been forgotten about. But BFI do a great job of bringing these films back from the dead, essentially. If you're a fan of Jenny Agutter, it's an absolute must. But it's a wonderful example and a wonderful kind of use of that time in Britain. You know, we're past the swinging 60s, we're before all the strikes and all the 3-day weeks or whatever it was, all the blackouts. This hope of new towns. It's just an interesting film, and I would highly recommend picking it up. So let me know if you've seen I Start Counting and what you think of it, and hopefully you'll join me again for more random reviews. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying cheerio.